Kia ora koutou. My name's Bonnie Robinson, and I was hoping to be with the group from the Presbyterian Church of Aotearoa, New Zealand, attending the UN Women's Congress, but unfortunately wasn't able to attend. So the group asked me to just record a few of my thoughts and ideas about the issue of the situation of older women as part of the presentation and seminar that our group will do for the UN Congress on Women. So what is the lens that we're all wearing when we look at the issues that are going to be discussed at the UN Congress this year? And does that lens help us to see older women? Do we see and think about older women when we're discussing policy issues, when we're looking at social service support, when we're looking at issues of the environment? Or do we only think about older women when we're talking about things that seem to be really specific to older people, things like pension policy and maybe healthcare? Probably many of us don't specifically think about older women when we're looking at these issues. Maybe some of us do if it's personal to us or an area of interest, but often in my experience as a provider of services for older women, that older women are a bit invisible in these discussions. Yet we know that older women are often more adversely affected by all the issues we discuss than other groups of women. There's various reasons for that, one of which is just the practical one that in Western developed nations at least, women live longer than men. So women have got a longer lifespan to deal with all of the many issues that face us all personally and that face us as societies. Women have to finance a longer lifespan, and they have to finance a longer section of life where they may not be in paid employment. So they've got to acquire more financial support for that longer lifespan. And because women live longer, and as we age, we naturally attract some disability and some frailty and naturally need some support. Women are more likely to be in need of both health services but also daily support services to help them continue to lead good lives into their older age. They're also more likely to be carers. Older women often have the dual situation of needing care themselves, but also being looked to provide care either for younger members of the family or for older spouses and partners. And we know that in times of crisis, either in families, in communities, in societies, older women often fare worse or are expected to bear and do bear a larger amount of the burden. So in times of shortage of food, we know that older women often get less food than others in the family. And in times of environmental crisis, older women can be more adversely affected by what's happening. And yet often they remain invisible in the policy and the support discussions and planning. The older women are grouped in with older people if older people are thought about at all, but the special needs of older women are not looked at. And older women also get the double whammy of sexism and ageism, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. So the situation of older women does need our special concern, which is why I was encouraged for us to spend time at this UN Congress just focusing a bit on the needs of older women. I think there's several reasons why older women are often invisible in all these discussions. And that's because they often are invisible in our societies. I think particularly in Western developed societies like New Zealand, older women can be quite invisible and their needs not seen and not particularly talked about because of that. So for example, in New Zealand at the moment, particularly in our major cities, we're having a housing crisis. Housing affordability is a real problem. But in general, the focus there is on younger people and on families. And the images that we see in the media are of families sleeping in cars because they can't afford housing. And while that is a problem that we're trying to struggle with, and the needs of our families and our young children are really urgent, I know from what I see in my work with older people and older women that we have that problem with older women as well, but we don't see it. Because when you're in your 70s or 80s, pretty much you can't sleep in your car. It's just not physically possible for you. So that can't be your solution to your housing problem. So we know, because we provide housing as part of our services, that there are older women in their 70s and 80s sleeping on friends' couches, which is not suitable for someone in that age bracket. Or they're living with family, but it's an abusive situation, or it is not working out, but they have nowhere else to go because they cannot afford the market rentals that are out there. We know there are women living in physically inadequate housing, so living in converted garages, which is tough enough when you're young, but when you're in your 70s or 80s, it's extremely difficult. Or they're living in housing that might have been suitable once, but is no longer suitable now. They've got some frailty to do with old age because there's too many steps, or it's in a physical location that's difficult for them. But they can't afford to move because anywhere that's more suitable is too expensive. But all that's hidden. You don't see that. You don't hear about the housing needs of older women in the media, and so it doesn't get a lot of attention. And a lot of the low-cost housing that our government's trying to build is really focused on families, and it's mostly two-storied. And looking with the lens of the needs of older women, I look at it and go, what will happen when the woman in that housing gets old? Where are they going to live? I think another reason that we don't often talk about the needs of older women specifically in policy and service discussions, particularly maybe in societies like New Zealand, is that there is, to a certain extent, quite a lot of ageism built into our society. In fact, I think ageism has become the last publicly acceptable form of discrimination in New Zealand. In New Zealand, we've done a lot around human rights and anti-discrimination, and even though people may still hold those views around racism and homophobia and sexism, and those things still happen, people know that it's not considered appropriate, and we have legislation which is upheld. And although there is anti-ageism built into our human rights legislation, we're still quite comfortable being publicly ageist in a range of situations. And I reflect on the compliments that I hear the older women who are using our services are often getting. And people mean well, and it's lovely that people compliment people. But if you listen to them, you recognise that actually there's ageism built into it. So you hear a lot of, goodness, you don't look your age. You're looking great for your age. You wouldn't know you're as old as you are. And while they are meant to be complimentary, and we don't want people to stop talking with and complimenting, particularly our old woman, what they're really saying is, don't get old, and if you do get old, don't look old, because somehow being old, whatever being old means, is not a good thing, and you're complimented for not looking old and therefore potentially not getting old. And yet we know that how we look as we age, as long as we've been able to live a healthy life, is pretty much determined by our DNA. So there's nothing in it, we've done nothing special if we look younger than somebody else, whatever looking younger might mean. So that ageism is kind of so inherently there that I think we often don't recognise that we are building it in to our policies and our support structures. For example, as an older person in New Zealand, we're very lucky. If you need care and support, you get it. And then it's a mix of whether you pay or the government, depending on your income. So that's fantastic. Older people, older women here do get support services and health care that they need. But a lot of the support services, especially to help us remain at home as we age, are actually built around replacing the work that women have traditionally done in the home. So you can get housework, you can get meals, you can get your vacuuming done. What you can't get done are the things that men traditionally did around the home in New Zealand society. So you can't get gardening, and you can't get lawn mowing, and you can't get home maintenance. You can't get someone who'll come in and change that light bulb that you can't change anymore because you can't stand on a ladder safely to do that. You can get that if you can pay for it, but if you're needing the government to support you because you're on a low income, you can't get that kind of support. So older women live longer, are more likely to need support, but are less likely to get exactly the kind of support that they do need. And that's because when we created those services, we didn't look with a lens that saw older women as having specific needs. Another place where ageism, I think, is seen in New Zealand and that the bias is still acceptable is around employment. We know that, and this starts from the age of 50 in general, we know that people over 50, men as well, have much more difficulty getting a job if they're not in employment, or shifting to a new job or a better job post 50. And that's an ageist bias that we're really struggling to overcome, where it's seen that old people over 50, employers think, well, they're just going to retire soon, and yet people have at least another 15, if not another 20 years of working life after the age of 50. Or they think that they won't be able to cope with technology, when in fact people in their 50s have usually gone from no technology to using technology every day and actually have a lot of skills. They think that people over 50 will take more sick days, when in fact all the statistics show that it's younger people that take more sick days. But it's very, very hard to overcome that inherent bias towards people who are getting older. And for older women, it's even harder. The ageism in employment is even more significant for older women. And of course, if you can't get employment post 50, you can't stack up that resource for your older age, which for women is going to be longer. So all of those things mean that older women and their needs are often invisible in all these discussions. And we don't have a lot of positive role models of older women in the media because of the cult of liking youth. And in fact, when people are advertising products for use of older people, often the people they've got in are either very young older people or extremely old older people. We don't get the reality of that mix of people from the age of 65 up to 100 and what that looks like in real life. And so the consequences of that is that it just makes life more difficult for older women, particularly older women who are on low incomes, and in New Zealand particularly older women who are of different ethnicities, who for all the problems are made worse. So what do we do to make older women's lives better? I think tackling ageism for me is one of the key things. We need to actually unpack and re-examine our attitudes to getting older and to mortality and to all that brings, and unpack assumptions that we've got. Because until we do that, they're going to be continually built into the policies that we've got. I think we need positive images and role models of older women who are publicly seen and are in leadership positions, so that we can see that getting older does not mean the inevitable decline. It does not mean that you can't participate, and does not mean that you're not of value or valued in society. And we need our support services and the policies around supporting older people to be more flexible and to take into account the needs of older women and their different circumstances, so that we don't have a one-size-fits-all approach to how we support people. From a biblical perspective, I think if you look carefully in a lot of the biblical stories, there are positive images of older women who influenced how faith was expressed, and who gave prophecy and messages of hope to their people down through the biblical ages. And that's a positive role model for women of faith to hold on to. And I know that my colleagues who are at the UN are going to talk to you some more about that. But we need those positive images so that older women know that they are valued, that they have a voice, and that they are not invisible. So I guess my challenge to everyone, including myself, but everyone who's here at the UN Congress on Women this year, is to say, could you put a lens on that sees older women and what their issues are and promotes the issues of older women? Because if we're lucky and we live in a country where people do get old, and I know that some of you live in countries where that is a great privilege that is only for a few, but if you have that privilege of getting to old age as a woman, we want to make that a time which is positive and a time where we continue to use the valuable skills and wisdom that women can bring, and use that to make our communities and our families and our whole world a better place.